Chapter 15. Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it might be, said George. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky sighed. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and a cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and shouted, "What's going on around here? Why hasn't anybody bought me a morning cup of tea? It's bad enough I have to sleep out here in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs, no bacon, no buttered toast." "I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky said. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that the cup was full of brown liquid. It still looked very much like tea. "Ho, ho!" she cried. "Ha, ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring your poor old Grandma one. I always knew you were a selfish pig." "No, Grandma," George said. This isn't." "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter trying to stop me from having breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled quite sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't you think that I won't?" said Grandma, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. "Hand it over, George." "No, Grandma," George shouted, pulling the cup away. You mustn't have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "No, don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's Marvellous." "Everything is George's around here," shouted Grandma. "George this, George that. I am fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of George's little hands and carried it high up out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said. "Lovely, lovely tea." "No!" the others cried. "No, no, 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 no." But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips and in one gulp had swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother!" wailed Mrs. Cranky. "You've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and look what a tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen." Grandma didn't even hear. Steam clouds were already pouring out of her ears, and she was also beginning to whistle. This This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, said Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam had started shooting out from Grandma's mouth and her nose and her ears, whistling as it came. Oh, she'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, said Mr. Cranky. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of her skinny old head, and the whistling was so high and shrill that it hurt his ears. Call the fire brigade, yelled Mrs. Cranky. Call the police! Man the hose pipes! Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased with himself. Grandma! Wailed Mrs. Cranky. To the water trough and put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms again. Watch what happens when someone has 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. Stop, said Mrs. Cranky. That's just right. But she didn't stop. She got smaller and smaller. She went down and down. In another half a minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. How do you feel, Mother? Asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face was still foul, and she had a furious expression like she'd always had. Her eyes, no bigger than keyholes, were blazing with anger. She yelled. She's still going, said Mr. Cranky. She's getting smaller and smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hand and cried, How do I stop her from getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She's had 50 times the right amount. But I must stop her, said Mrs. Cranky. I can hardly see her. Catch hold of each end and pull, said Mr. Cranky. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, and then... Where is she? Cried Mrs. Cranky. We've lost her. Hooray! Cried Mr. Cranky. She's gone. She's completely disappeared, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's what happens if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George. George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky just kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I get you back? But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, Oh, well, I suppose it's for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? Yes, Mr. Cranky said. She certainly was. George didn't say a word. He actually felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning, and for a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magical world. The